When my father's will was read, my sisters laughed before the lawyer even finished his sentence. I can still hear the sound of it. Sharp and smug. Like they'd been waiting years for that exact moment. Lydia leaned over to Claire and whispered, "He gets the fishing box." As if it were the punchline to a cruel joke. And maybe it was. Because everyone in that room, including my mother, seemed to think that was all I deserved. I sat there trying to keep my hands still on the polished table, pretending not to notice the way Claire was already snapping a picture of the box with her phone. The caption would probably read something clever like, "Mom's sense of humor lives on." The lawyer, Mr. Peterson, cleared his throat, his voice dry as paper. "To my son, Ethan Miller, I leave my fishing tackle box. It has been in my possession since 1985. It is to be given to him immediately." That was it. No house. No company shares. Not even a keepsake from the family home. Just a beat-up metal box that used to smell like bait and salt water. My mother sat across the table, perfectly composed in her gray suit, her pearl earrings catching the light. She looked at me with that same expression she'd worn my entire adult life. The one that said, I was the wrong kind of son. "Your father wanted to teach you a lesson, Ethan," she said, her voice cool. "Maybe you'll finally learn it this time." The lawyer closed the file. And just like that, it was over. Lydia stood, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "Well, Claire, looks like we have some estate business to handle. You know, adult stuff." She smiled at me without warmth. "Good luck with your treasure." Claire laughed as she slid her phone into her purse. "You could always restore it. Ethan, make it look fancy. That's what you do. Right." I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. I took the box, heavy with rust and dust, and walked out of the glass tower that had been my mother's lawyer's office. Outside, Boston was loud and cold. Cars honked. People hurried past. And I stood there like I'd just walked out of someone else's life. The valet didn't even try to hide his smirk when he saw what I was carrying. "Need help with that, sir?" he asked. I shook my head. "No. I've got it." He nodded, probably thinking the box was full of fishing junk. He was right. Of course. Back home in Bar Harbor, my repair shop smelled of oil, salt, and varnish. It always did. I set the box on my workbench, brushed off the dust, and just looked at it. The metal was scarred with years of use. The hinges stiff, the latch slightly bent. My father's initials, H. M., were etched on the top, almost rubbed away by time. I hadn't seen that box since I was a kid, back when he'd take me out on the water every Saturday morning before sunrise. For a long time, I just stood there, remembering. My father, Henry Miller, wasn't the kind of man who cared about money or titles. He built boats, fixed engines, taught me how to tie knots and how to wait for a bite. He used to say patience was the difference between catching dinner and going home hungry. My mother hated it. She'd tell him he was wasting his life, that he should have been more ambitious. Maybe that's why she never forgave me for following in his footsteps. I ran my fingers over the latch, hesitated, then opened it. Inside were the same old lures and hooks I remembered. The same smell of sea salt and machine oil. The colors had faded. The feathers on the flies gone brittle. A few rusty pliers. A cracked bobber. An old pocket knife. At the very bottom, tucked beneath a layer of yellowed receipts, was a small piece of paper folded twice. It was a pawn shop receipt. Holloway Pawn and Loan. Manhattan. Date March 6. Lianqianlingwu. Amount confidential. The signature at the bottom was my father's. For a moment, I just stared at it, confused. My father never pawned anything in his life. He didn't believe in selling memories. I turned the paper over, expecting more. And there it was, scrawled in his handwriting. "When you're ready, call." I laughed quietly, but it wasn't a happy laugh. Ready for what he'd been dead for 20 years. The whole thing felt like a bad joke. Maybe that's what this was all along. My mother's final act of humiliation, making me dig through old junk to find another reminder that I'd failed to live up to her standards. Still, I couldn't throw it away. I folded the receipt carefully and set it next to the coffee maker in my small apartment above the shop. That night, I poured myself a drink and sat by the window. The box opened beside me, moonlight catching the edge of the metal. I told myself I didn't care, that I didn't need whatever nonsense this was. But the truth is, something about it wouldn't let me sleep. The next morning, I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. Her tone clipped. "Ethan, what is it?" "I found a receipt in the box," I said. "From a pawn shop in Manhattan. Did you know about it?" She was silent for a moment, then said, "Your father's secrets died with him. Leave it alone." "Secrets?" I asked. But she'd already hung up. I stared at the phone for a long time. My mother was many things smart, ruthless, always in control, but she was a terrible liar. Whatever was in that pawn shop, she knew about it, and whatever it was, she didn't want me to find it. That alone was reason enough. That night, I packed a small bag, locked up the shop, and tossed the tackle box into the back seat of my truck. The highway stretched out under the fading light. The kind of long, a lonely road that gives a man too much time to think. My father used to say, the best catches always hid deep, where no one bothered to look, somewhere between Maine and Manhattan. I realized I was finally ready to find out what he meant. The drive to Manhattan felt longer than it should have. The farther I got from the coast, the more everything started to blur together. Gas stations, rest stops, the same gray clouds stretching across the sky. I wasn't sure what I was chasing, but it felt like something I couldn't turn away from. My father's handwriting on that old receipt kept replaying in my head. "When you're ready, call." It wasn't just words. It was a challenge. By the time I reached the city, it was late afternoon. The skyline rose like steel and glass cliffs, cold and enormous. I found a cheap parking garage a few blocks from the address on the receipt and stepped out into the noise of Manhattan. The street was lined with faded signs and small shops wedged between new apartment buildings that looked too clean to belong there. Holloway Pawn and Loan was smaller than I'd imagined. The sign above the door was rusted, and half the letters were missing. Inside, it smelled like dust, old leather, and metal polish. Every surface was covered in something from another time. Watches, cameras, fishing rods, even a jukebox in the corner that probably hadn't worked since the 90s. Behind the counter stood an older man with a trimmed white beard and a steady gaze. He looked up when the bell above the door rang. His voice was rough but calm. "Help you with something?" I walked up to the counter and placed the folded receipt in front of him. "I found this in my father's things. He passed away a long time ago. Henry Miller. I think he did business here." The man's expression changed. He picked up the paper slowly, reading it like it was a piece of history. When he looked back at me, his eyes were sharp. "Henry Miller," he repeated, almost to himself. "You're his boy." I nodded. "Yes, sir." For a second, he didn't say anything. Then he called toward the back room. "David, come out here a minute." A younger man, maybe mid-30s, walked out, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked me over like he was sizing me up. "What's going on?" The old man, Frank, as I'd later learn, held up the receipt. "Says he's Henry Miller's son." David frowned. "That name's on the old ledger." "Right. Yeah," Frank said. "From 2005. David's eyes narrowed on me. "Got any proof of that? Anybody can walk in here with a story." Something in his tone lit a spark in me. I wasn't there for a handout. I pulled my wallet from my back pocket and took out my driver's license. Then I unfolded an old photo I'd kept in the box. One of me and my father standing beside a small fishing boat, both of us sunburned and grinning. Frank took the photo, studying it. His expression softened. "Yeah, that's Henry. Same eyes." He handed it back and looked at his son. "It's him." David hesitated but nodded. "Guess it's time then." Frank disappeared into the back and came out holding a small fireproof box. He set it on the counter, his hands trembling slightly. "Your father left this here. Said it was for you. But only when you came yourself. No mail. No lawyers. No one else." My chest tightened. "He left it 20 years ago. Almost to the day," Frank said quietly. Told me you'd show up when you were ready. He unlocked the box and lifted the lid. Inside was a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, and a small card the size of a credit card. He slid both toward me. He wanted me to say this when you came. What's valuable isn't always what shines. I never understood it, but he made me promise to repeat it word for word. I stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. My hands shook as I unfolded the letter inside. My father's handwriting filled the page, steady and deliberate. If you're reading this, son, it means you didn't let pride or fear stop you. Inside the card you'll find the number of a man named Charles Bennett at Zurich Trust Bank. He's held something for our family since the day I left North Shore Engineering. Don't ask your mother. She wouldn't understand. Take the tackle box with you. It's proof of who you are. When you meet Bennett, you'll know the truth. There was no signature, just his name at the bottom, written like a whisper of memory. Henry Miller. I looked up at Frank. He mentioned Zurich, a bank. Frank nodded. He said it was overseas, something to do with his work. He told me once that silence was sometimes the loudest way to tell the truth. David crossed his arms. You really think there's money sitting in some Swiss vault waiting for you? That's fairy tale stuff. I slipped the letter back into the envelope. I don't know what to think, but I'm going to find out. Frank gave me a small, tired smile. Then I guess you'd better call that number. The old man believed in you, even when no one else did. Outside, the streetlights had flickered on, and the city hummed around me like an endless machine. I sat in my truck for a while, holding the envelope, watching people hurry past on the sidewalk. When I finally called the number on the card, the line rang twice before a woman answered. Her voice was crisp and professional. Zurich Trust Bank. International Services. How may I assist you? I swallowed hard. I'm calling about an account. My name is Ethan Miller. My father was Henry Miller. There was a pause. I thought maybe the call had dropped. Then another voice came on. Older. Slower. With a hint of weight behind it. Mr. Miller. He said, "We've been expecting your call." I froze. Expecting my call? My father died 20 years ago. Yes. The man said, "Your father made arrangements that could only be activated by you personally. After a specific time. You need to come in. Mr. Miller. Bring the tackle box and your identification. The account is ready to be released." I stared at the dashboard. The city's noise fading to nothing. I don't understand. What account? Not over the phone. The voice replied gently. Your father was very clear about that. Can you be here within 72 hours? I didn't answer right away. My father's letter, the tackle box, the pawn receipt, all of it tangled in my mind like fishing line caught on a rock. Finally, I said, "I'll be there." "Good," the man said. "Ask for Charles Bennett when you arrive. And Mr. Miller. Bring the box. You'll need it." The line went dead. For a long moment I just sat there, staring out the windshield, feeling the weight of something I couldn't yet name, pressing against my chest. My father's voice echoed in my memory, quiet and certain. "Patience, son. Always patience." I looked at the box on the seat beside me, the same one my sisters had mocked. And for the first time, it didn't look worthless. It looked like the beginning of an answer I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. I didn't sleep that night. The phone call kept looping in my head. The man's calm voice saying they had been expecting me. I kept hearing my father's handwriting in my mind. The line about being ready. Around 3 a.m, I gave up trying to rest, brewed a pot of coffee, and spread the contents of the tackle box out on my workbench. The hooks, the lures, the pocket knife, even the faded map folded in the bottom. All of it suddenly looked different, like pieces of a message I hadn't learned to read yet. By sunrise, I'd made up my mind. Zurich wasn't next on the list. Before flying halfway across the world, I needed to understand what my father had left behind here. The man on the phone had said to bring the box, but I couldn't shake the feeling there was still something I was missing. I packed the box carefully, locked up the shop, and hit the road. On the passenger seat, the envelope from Frank's shop sat beside a thermos of coffee. I drove north out of the city, heading toward Boston. My father's old friend, Tom Jensen. Dill lived there. I hadn't seen him since the funeral, but I remembered him as the kind of man who always kept the truth close until someone earned it. If anyone knew what my father had done before he died, it would be Tom. Boston looked different now. All glass and tech campuses where there used to be warehouses. Tom's address led me to a small two-story house in Quincy. The kind with a flag on the porch and a lawn that had seen too many New England winters. I knocked twice. The door opened halfway. Tom stood there. Older. Heavier. But the same piercing eyes. It took him a second to recognize me. When he did, he let out a quiet breath. Ethan Miller. I'll be damned. You look just like your father. He stepped aside and motioned me in. The living room smelled of coffee and sawdust. The kind of mix that felt like home. He poured 2 cups and set one in front of me. I heard about your mom's will, he said after a moment. That was cruel. Even for her. I stared into my cup. She gave my sisters everything. I got Dad's old fishing box. He frowned. That box still around. I nodded and slid it onto the table. That's why I'm here. There was a pawn shop receipt inside. Holloway Pawn in Manhattan. I went there yesterday. They gave me a letter from Dad. Said there's something in Zurich waiting for me. Do you know anything about that? Tom leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. Yeah. I figured this would come back around one day. What do you mean? He walked over to a cabinet and pulled out a dusty folder. The edges frayed. Your dad and I worked together at North Shore Engineering. Back then, we were designing hydraulic systems for naval vessels. Brilliant stuff. Your father came up with a design that changed the way the whole system operated. Safer. More efficient. It should have made him a millionaire. I looked up. But it didn't. No. Tom said softly. Because someone else made sure of that. Richard Shaw. Our boss at the time. He took the design. Claimed it as a company patent. And forced your dad to sign over his rights. Told him it was standard procedure. Henry knew better. He could have fought it. Could have dragged the company into court. But he didn't. Said it wasn't worth ruining his family over. My chest tightened. So he just let them steal it. Tom shook his head. Not exactly. A week later he came to me with a grin and said, "Sometimes you win by losing quietly." I didn't understand it then. But a few days before he died, he sent me a sealed package. Told me to hold on to it in case his son ever came asking questions. He went to the cabinet again and returned with a small wooden box. Locked with a brass clasp. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside were copies of design patents. All dated under North Shore Engineering. And a set of handwritten blueprints signed by Henry Miller. Each corner bore his initials. H. M. And a stamp from a Swiss notary. Tom pointed to one of the documents. That one there. It lists a private account under Zurich Trust. Your father told me every royalty payment tied to that design was being redirected there. He said it wasn't for him. It was for you. I stared at the papers, unable to speak. 20 years of silence suddenly made sense. My father hadn't been broken. He'd been planning. Why didn't he tell me? I finally asked. Tom smiled sadly. Because he knew you wouldn't believe it until you were ready. You had to find it on your own. He wanted you to know the value of patience. I leaned back, the air thick with the weight of it all. My father hadn't died a failure. He'd died protecting something he'd built. And all this time, my mother had let the world believe she was the successful one. Tom poured more coffee. His hand steady. You going to Zurich? I guess I have to. I said. Whatever's there. It's the truth. And I think my mom knows something about it. When I called her yesterday, she told me to leave it alone. She sounded scared. Tom gave a quiet laugh. Then you're definitely on the right trail. Henry used to say, your mother's fear was always a sign he was getting close to something real. The thought made me smile, though it hurt. When I stood to leave, Tom put a hand on my shoulder. Your father was the best man I ever worked with. He didn't care about fame or credit. He just wanted his work to mean something. Don't let anyone twist that. Outside, the late afternoon sky had turned silver. The kind of Boston light that looked like it could snow or rain. Maybe both. I sat in my truck, staring at the old blueprints beside me. and called my mother again. She picked up on the third ring. "What are you doing?" "Ethan," she asked, her voice tight. "Going to Zurich." I said simply, "Dad left something there." "You don't understand what you're getting into. Leave it alone." "I think I do understand," I said quietly. "You let everyone believe he was nothing. And he let you. Because he loved you. That's what scares you. Isn't it? That he was the better person all along." There was a pause. Then the sound of her breath catching. "Don't you dare talk to me like that." "I'm not," I said. "I'm talking to the woman who once loved him." The line went dead. I sat there for a long time, watching the light fade. Then I started the engine and turned onto the interstate. The road stretched out before me like a question waiting for an answer. I didn't know what I would find in Zurich. But for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. My father had left breadcrumbs through decades of silence. And now, finally, I was following them. The flight to Zurich felt endless. I kept replaying the conversation with my mother in my head, her voice sharp and cold, like a door slamming shut. I told myself I didn't care, that I was only doing this for answers. But the truth sat heavier than that. I needed to know who my father really was, not the version she built after he was gone. When the plane landed, the sky over Zurich was gray and low. The air smelled clean, too clean, like rain and marble. I took a cab into the city, passing quiet streets lined with buildings that looked older than time. Everything about the place felt deliberate, like it was built by people who never rushed anything. The Zurich Trust Bank stood at the corner of Bahnhofstrasse. All stone columns and brass doors polished so bright you could see your reflection. I walked inside clutching the tackle box, trying not to feel out of place among people in suits who looked like they were born wearing them. A receptionist greeted me with a professional smile. "Good morning. How can we assist you?" "My name is Ethan Miller," I said. "I was told to come here." I spoke with a Mr. Bennett. Her expression changed. She typed something into her computer, then looked up again. Her tone different now. "Of course. Mr. Miller. Please wait just a moment." A few minutes later, an older man appeared in the hallway. Tall. Silver hair. Tailored suit. He carried himself like someone used to being obeyed but too polite to show it. "Mr. Miller," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Charles Bennett. Thank you for coming." His grip was firm, his eyes assessing but kind. "Your father spoke very highly of you," he said as he led me through a long corridor lined with portraits of serious-looking men in darker suits. He was quite insistent about how this should be handled. "I didn't know my father had business here," I said. "Few people did," Bennett replied. "Your father valued discretion above all else." We entered a private room that looked more like a library than a bank office. Shelves of ledgers, antique lamps, leather chairs. On the table sat a small metal case. Bennett gestured for me to sit. "Before we proceed, I'll need to confirm your identity. Your father left strict instructions." He nodded toward an assistant who entered carrying a small case. They drew a quick blood sample, scanned my fingerprints, and checked my passport. Every step felt clinical and precise. Bennett watched it all without saying a word, then finally nodded when the assistant handed him a tablet confirming the results. "Perfect," he said quietly. "Your father's conditions have been met." He unlocked the metal case. Inside was a folder thick with papers, several envelopes, and what looked like bank ledgers. He slid one across the table toward me. "Mr. Miller, your father was an exceptional engineer. What he created at North Shore wasn't just a design. It was the foundation for the hydraulic systems now used in most U.S. naval vessels, commercial aircraft, and construction equipment. The royalties alone over the past 2 decades have grown considerably." I stared at him, unsure I'd heard right. Royalties. He sold the patent. My mother said he took a payout. Bennett gave a faint smile. "That's what your mother was told. In truth, he never sold it. He transferred the patent ownership into a private trust here in Zurich. Every year, the companies that used his design paid directly into that trust." He turned the folder around. On the first page was a summary of the account's current balance. I blinked, thinking I'd misread the numbers. 52,400,000 U.S. dollars. My throat went dry. That can't be right. It's accurate. Bennett said, "Your father instructed us to keep the account sealed until you reached the age of 40 and your mother had passed away. He believed you needed to understand patience before wealth." I leaned back in the chair, the room spinning slightly. Why would he hide all this? Because he understood human nature. Bennett said softly. He knew this kind of money could destroy a family if it appeared too soon. He told me, "The truth will mean nothing to them unless time humbles them first." Into happened, and the wresser. I let out a shaky breath, staring at the number again. $52 million. My sisters had spent years calling me the family disappointment, mocking the way I worked with my hands. And my father, the man they called a failure, had been quietly sitting on a fortune that made all their inheritance look small. Bennett placed another envelope in front of me. "This is your father's final letter." He wanted it read privately. I opened it with hands that wouldn't stay still. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Son, if you're reading this, you've already learned what money can and cannot buy. I left the truth buried because your mother needed her pride more than I needed credit. Let her believe she built her world alone. It made her strong. What I built was for you, not to make you rich, but to remind you that quiet work still has value in a loud world. When you feel lost, remember this real worth is never on display." There was a key taped to the bottom of the letter, small and brass. Underneath it, a line in smaller writing. "It unlocks what I left behind in Bar Harbor." I closed the letter, my chest tightening with something I couldn't name. Bennett watched me silently, respectful of the moment. "He left something else?" I asked. "Yes." Bennett said. "He mentioned a property. A workshop in Bar Harbor. It's been maintained in his name all these years. The expenses have been drawn automatically from the trust." I looked up, stunned. That shop was sold 20 years ago. My mother said she liquidated it after his death. Bennett smiled faintly. "Apparently she didn't. Your father arranged a holding company to buy it under a different name. It's still there, exactly as he left it." I felt the air leave my lungs. My father's old workshop, the place where I learned to build boats, where he taught me the value of patience and precision. I hadn't stepped foot inside it since the funeral. "Mr. Bennett," I said quietly, "my family doesn't know about any of this." He folded his hands. He expected that. He believed they'd learn their lessons in time. "He asked me to tell you one thing if you ever doubted your path." He paused, his voice lowering. He said, "Tell my son he was never the failure. He was the proof that I was right." It won't mean less of Menedy. Something inside me cracked then. A pressure I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for 20 years. I thought of my mother, her perfect posture at the will reading, my sisters laughing. I thought of my father, silent, patient, smiling in every photograph like he knew something the rest of us didn't. Bennett stood, extending his hand again. "Mr. Miller, your father was a man of extraordinary foresight. He didn't just leave you money, he left you a legacy." I shook his hand, my grip firm this time. Then it's time I finally lived up to it. Outside, the sky had started to clear. Snow was melting off the rooftops, dripping down onto the cobblestones. I stepped into the cold air holding the tackle box, the letter, and the key, feeling the weight of all three. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing anything. I was exactly where my father wanted me to be. The air in Zurich had a way of cutting straight through you, sharp and clean, like it was trying to strip away anything false. I walked along the cobblestone street outside the bank, the tackle box under my arm, still heavy with its own kind of gravity. I stopped at a cafe across from the square, ordered a black coffee, and sat by the window. The paper with the account number and the letter from my father lay flat on the table. $52 million. I said the number quietly under my breath just to make it sound real. But it didn't. It sounded like a number from someone else's life. For a long time, I didn't touch the coffee. My reflection in the glass looked like a man trying to recognize himself. My father had been called a failure. A man who threw away his career to build boats in a shed. My mother had made sure that story stuck. But the truth sitting in my hands was louder than all her lies. When I finally left the cafe, I took a long walk through the old part of the city. Everything there felt deliberate, patient, like the kind of place my father would have loved. He was never in a hurry. He always said that the best work came from stillness. I could almost hear his voice saying it again. Soft but certain. I flew back to the States that night. The letter, the documents, and the brass key never left my jacket pocket. When I landed in Boston, I rented a truck and drove straight to Bar Harbor. The roads were empty, the air thick with the smell of pine and salt. By the time I reached the edge of town, the sun was breaking through a low bank of fog, lighting up the water like glass. The workshop sat just where it always had, on a quiet stretch near the docks. The sign above the door had faded, but I could still make out the words Miller Marine Repair. My mother had told everyone she sold the place to pay off my father's debts. But the lock on the door was new, and the building looked far too well kept for something abandoned 20 years ago. The key from Zurich fit perfectly. When I pushed the door open, the smell hit me first. Wood shavings, varnish, salt. It was like stepping back in time. Every tool was in its place. Every piece of machinery covered neatly with a cloth. The lights flickered on with a low hum when I hit the switch. The benches, the cabinets, even the small radio. My father used to play old country songs. It was all there. I walked slowly through the space, tracing my fingers along the workbench where I'd watched him shape wood for hours. The grain of the table was smooth in some places, worn thin in others. In the corner sat an old drafting desk, covered in blueprints. My father's handwriting was everywhere. Notes in the margins, sketches of designs that looked far ahead of their time. On the main workbench sat a single envelope, yellowed with age. My name was written across it. I opened it carefully. Inside was a short letter, his handwriting steady and clear. Ethan, if you've come this far, then you've already learned what I couldn't teach you when I was alive. This place was never sold. It was preserved. Every tool here has been oiled and cared for. Every month. For 20 years. You were meant to find it when you understood what work truly means. Money can build a life, but work gives it meaning. Keep both honest. There was another smaller note folded inside, written in my mother's hand. The date at the top was from just before she died. I know what your father did. I know how he protected me, even from my own pride. The briefcase wasn't an insult. It was an apology. I hope you'll forgive me for not seeing sooner what he saw in you. I sat on the workbench for a long time, the papers in my lap. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows, catching in the air like gold. My father's voice echoed in my head. Something he'd told me once when I was 15. Patience is not waiting, son. It's working while you wait. That's when I noticed the photographs pinned to the far wall. Dozens of them, framed neatly. My father standing with people I didn't recognize. Men in suits, naval officers, engineers. In one photo, he was shaking hands with a man who looked like a senator. In another, he was standing beside a large machine with the North Shore Engineering logo printed on it. Each picture had a small brass plate beneath it, engraved with words like Prototype Approval, U.S. Navy Commission, and Design Patent Launch. He had done it all quietly, behind the scenes, while letting everyone think he'd failed. I walked deeper into the workshop and found 3 smaller chairs lined against the wall, each made of cherry wood, perfectly crafted. My name was carved into one, and my sister's names into the others. The finish was flawless, every joint seamless. I remembered him working on these one summer when we were kids. My mother had called them childish and told him to throw them out. I hadn't known he kept them. The emotion came fast and heavy. No warning. No build-up. I sat down on the floor beside those chairs and let it wash over me. 20 years of believing he'd died a broken man. 20 years of silence that now spoke louder than anything my family had ever said. After a while, I stood and took a deep breath. There was one thing left to do. I locked up the workshop, drove into town, and called my sisters. Claire answered first. Her voice was already impatient. Ethan, I don't have time for whatever this is. Mom's estate is still being processed. If this is about money, it's not about money, I said quietly. It's about Dad. You both need to see something. Come to Bar Harbor tomorrow. Noon. Bring your husbands. Lydia cut in on speaker. Is this some kind of stunt? Because if it is, I swear. Just come. I said. If I'm wrong, you'll get to laugh at me again. But if I'm right, you'll wish you hadn't. There was a long silence. Then Claire sighed. Fine. Noon. But this better not be one of your guilt trips. I hung up before she could say anything else. That night I stayed in the workshop, sleeping on the old couch in the corner. The building creaked softly in the wind. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace. The tackle box sat on the table beside me, the brass key resting on top. I ran my fingers over the initials H, M. Still faint but visible. When I finally closed my eyes, I saw my father standing at the end of the dock, son on his shoulders, smiling the way he always did when the world thought he'd lost. In the morning, I would open the doors and show them everything. The truth. The proof. The legacy. And for once, they wouldn't have anything left to laugh about. The morning light came early, sharp through the salt-fogged windows. I opened the doors of the workshop wide and let the smell of the sea roll in. It mixed with the old scents of varnish and cedar, the same smells that used to cling to my father's clothes when I was a kid. I swept the floor, wiped down the benches, and uncovered the 3 cherrywood chairs. The grain caught the light just right. They looked alive. By noon, I heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel outside. 2 black SUVs pulled up like they were arriving for a business deal. Lydia stepped out first. In heels too expensive for this kind of ground. Her husband, Brandon, followed. Already talking on his phone, Claire got out of the other car, her coat swinging like she was walking into court. Her husband, Darren, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Lydia crossed her arms, scanning the place. So this is it, the great Miller workshop. You dragged us all the way up here for a nostalgia tour. Something like that, I said. You might want to see what's inside before you start with the sarcasm. Claire gave a short laugh. This better not be another one of your sentimental projects. Ethan, we're too old for family drama. I didn't answer. I just turned and walked inside, letting them follow if they wanted. After a moment, their footsteps echoed behind me. When they stepped in, both of them stopped. The space seemed to quiet around them. Lydia ran a finger across one of the benches. It's so clean. You actually kept this place up. I didn't. I said, Dad did. He paid for monthly maintenance through a holding company. The same one Mom said bought this place to cover his debts. She frowned. That doesn't make sense. Mom said it was liquidated 20 years ago. Yeah, I said. Mom said a lot of things. I walked over to the main bench and opened the folder I'd brought back from Zurich. Before either of you start asking questions, you should see this. I handed them copies of the trust documents. Their eyes moved over the pages, confusion slowly hardening into disbelief. Claire was the first to speak. This can't be real. $52 million. You're telling me Dad had that kind of money hidden somewhere? He didn't hide it, I said quietly. He protected it. From all of us. Lydia let out a dry laugh. Right. So the man who couldn't even afford to fix the roof on our house somehow became a secret millionaire. Sure. Ethan. I opened another folder and laid the blueprints on the table. The ones Tom had given me. These are Dad's original designs. The patents that North Shore Engineering used to build their hydraulic systems. Every piece of machinery that came out of that company started with these drawings. He never sold them. He transferred ownership to a private trust in Zurich. Claire's husband leaned over the papers. These look legitimate, he said under his breath. The signatures. The notary seals. This is Swiss banking-level documentation. Lydia turned to me, her face tightening. So what? You're rich now, you're going to lord it over us. Congratulations. Little brother. You finally got your payday. I met her glare calmly. You really think this is about money? You and Claire spent your whole lives trying to be like Mom, pretending success made you better than him. The man you both mocked built half the systems that run this country, and he did it quietly, without taking credit. Her voice cracked. Why would he lie to us? He didn't lie. I said. He just didn't need to prove anything. The silence that followed was thick. Claire folded her arms, staring at the floor. So what happens now? Before I could answer, Brandon stepped forward, his tone sharp. You realize, if this is true, that money technically belongs to the estate. That means you'll have to share it with your family. I almost laughed. Funny. None of you wanted to share anything when Mom left me a box of fishing gear. He bristled. That's not the same thing. It's exactly the same thing, I said. Except this time, the box actually meant something. Lydia's voice rose. You can't just keep all of it. Ethan, there are legal processes. We'll contest it. I'd been expecting that. I walked over to the workbench, reached for the small TV remote I'd brought, and hit play. The screen flickered to life, showing a video recording from the Zurich bank office. Charles Bennett's calm voice filled the room. Mr. Ethan Miller has met all legal conditions outlined in Henry Miller's trust. The assets and properties contained within are the sole inheritance of Ethan Miller, to be released upon his verification. When the video ended, no one spoke. Claire's husband cleared his throat. That's pretty airtight. Lydia turned on me. You planned this. You think you can humiliate us the way Mom humiliated you. I met her gaze. Steady. I didn't plan anything. Dad did. I just followed the trail he left. Maybe humiliation's what it takes for you to understand who he really was. She took a step closer. You think you're better than us? No. I said. I think I finally understand him. The air felt heavy between us. Claire broke it with a whisper. Mom knew. Didn't she? I nodded. She left a letter. Said she knew what he'd done and that the tackle box wasn't an insult. It was an apology. Lydia sank into one of the cherrywood chairs, staring blankly ahead. For the first time in years, she looked small. All that time, all those fights, he let her hate him. Because he loved her. I said. Because she needed to believe she'd built it all herself. No one spoke after that. The sound of the waves outside filled the silence. The truth hung in the air like sawdust in sunlight. Impossible to ignore. When they finally left, no one looked back. The gravel crunched under their tires as they drove away. 2 dark cars disappearing down the road. That night, I sat in the workshop alone. The tackle box opened beside me. The lures and hooks were still there, dull and harmless. But the small folded receipt from Holloway Pawn and Loan sat on top. The first clue that started it all. The world outside was quiet. The tide came in slow, brushing against the rocks like a heartbeat. I thought about my father again, about the patience it took to let the truth surface on its own. I poured a cup of coffee, set it beside his old drafting desk, and looked around the room that had held 20 years of silence. Tomorrow, I'd call the lawyer. There would be papers to sign, transfers to make, 100 things to handle. But not tonight. Tonight, I just wanted to sit in the space he left me and listen to the sound of the sea. The next morning, I woke to the sound of gulls and the faint hum of a fishing boat leaving the harbor. The workshop was quiet, except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I made coffee, sat by the window, and watched the light break over the water. For a while, I let myself believe that everything was finally settled, that the truth had done its work and could rest now. But I should have known better. By noon, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages, missed calls, news alerts. It was Claire who finally sent the link. Miller family fortune exposed. The headline sat on top of a grainy picture of me outside the workshop. Someone had leaked the Zurich account story. My sisters hadn't wasted any time. I turned on the TV. There they were, sitting in a studio in New York, talking about how I had manipulated our father's estate and stolen from the family. Lydia's voice trembled just enough to sound convincing. He took advantage of an old man's confusion. She said, our father was unwell at the end. Ethan twisted his memory into something it wasn't. I stood there in the middle of the workshop, watching my own bloodline rewrite history on national television. Part of me wanted to fly to New York and set the record straight. But another part of me knew my father wouldn't have. He'd have waited for the truth to surface naturally. Because it always did. Still, I couldn't sit by forever. That afternoon, I called Tom Jensen. He answered on the second ring. I saw the interview. He said before I could speak, "They're digging their own graves. You okay?" "I don't know," I said. "They're making it sound like I forged everything." "Let them," he said. "They're about to learn that silence isn't weakness. You've got proof. Ethan. Solid proof. Your dad made sure of it." 2 days later, a reporter showed up outside the shop. Young. Confident. Microphone in hand. "Mr. Miller," she said. "Your sisters claim you're exploiting your father's name for personal gain. Do you have a comment?" I looked straight into the camera and kept my voice steady. My father was the kind of man who believed the truth didn't need shouting. He left his legacy in his work. Not in his words. When the facts come out, you'll understand which one of us really honored him. It aired that night. Within hours, my voicemail was full of messages from people who'd worked with Henry Miller at North Shore Engineering. One of them, an old project manager named Paul Garner, sent me an email with scanned documents. The original North Shore contracts. My father's name was clearly listed as the designer on every one of them. Paul called me the next day. "I stayed quiet all these years," he said. "Your dad told me to. But I've had enough of watching that company get rich off his work. If you need me to testify, I will." The legal wheels started turning faster than I expected. My sister's lawyers filed a suit claiming the trust was fraudulent. Mark Peterson, my father's old lawyer, took my case without hesitation. "Your father planned for this," he said during our first meeting. "Everything's documented, notarized, and traceable. They're walking into a trap they built themselves." The first hearing was brutal. Lydia sat across from me in the courtroom, dressed in black, her expression carefully rehearsed. She avoided my eyes. Claire whispered to her attorney like the whole thing was beneath her. Their lawyers painted me as a manipulative tradesman who'd stumbled onto old papers and spun a story for money. Then, Mark stood up, calm and deliberate. He projected the Zurich documents, the notarized patents, and the video of Charles Bennett confirming my identity. The courtroom fell silent. Every word was clear, factual, irrefutable. When it was over, the judge called for a recess. During the break, I stepped outside for air. Lydia followed, heels clicking against the marble floor. "You think this makes you the hero," she said. "You're destroying what's left of this family." "I'm not the one who went on national TV," I said quietly. She looked away, eyes glassy. "You don't get it. We grew up believing he left us with nothing, that he was ashamed of himself. You're rewriting everything we built our lives on." I shook my head. "No, Lydia. He's the one rewriting it. I'm just letting people read the truth." The trial lasted 3 weeks. By the end, their case had collapsed under its own weight. The judge ruled that the trust was valid, the inheritance legally and ethically mine. The decision was final. The news broke that night. Reporters swarmed the street outside my shop, cameras flashing, headlines spinning. But the story had already changed. Now it was about the silent engineer who outsmarted everyone. The man who hid a fortune for decades to teach his son a lesson in patience and integrity. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even watch the coverage. Instead, I went down to the dock, sat on the edge, and watched the water darken under the evening sky. My father's words came back to me again. The truth doesn't need a fight. It just needs time. Over the next few weeks, the fallout hit my sisters hard. Lydia's company dropped her after investors pulled out, citing ethical concerns. Her husband filed for divorce, and the tabloids had a field day. Claire was audited for tax evasion connected to her husband's real estate firm. The irony wasn't lost on me. One morning, a thick envelope arrived at the shop. Inside was a short note from my mother's lawyer and a single folded page in her handwriting. It was dated the same week she died. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means the truth finally found its way home. I tried to hold the family together by keeping your father's silence alive. But maybe I should have trusted you to understand sooner. I hope you'll forgive me for not standing by him when it mattered. He loved us both more than you'll ever know. I sat there for a long time with that letter in my hands. My anger toward her didn't vanish. But it softened. She had been a prisoner of her own pride. And pride was a harder jail than any made of steel. That evening, I locked up early and drove out to the bluff where my father used to take me fishing. The air smelled of salt and rain. I stood there watching the horizon fade into the sea. The same view he'd loved. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. The world had spun itself into a frenzy around me. But in that quiet stretch of coastline, none of it mattered. My father's lesson had finally taken root. Patience wasn't about waiting. It was about trusting that truth, like the tide, always comes back in. Weeks passed after the court's decision. But peace didn't come as easily as I thought it would. The shop was busy again. Orders coming in from collectors who'd read about my father's designs. But every time I picked up a chisel or brushed on varnish, the silence felt different. The weight of the truth had settled. But the emptiness left behind still echoed. I guess when you spend most of your life fighting to prove something, you don't know what to do when there's nothing left to fight. One cold Thursday morning, I got a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a check for $50,000 and a short note in Lydia's handwriting. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just trying to do one decent thing. She didn't sign her name. I stared at it for a long time before folding it back into the envelope. I didn't cash it. I put it in the tackle box with the rest of my father's things. Some debts can't be settled with money. Later that week, Claire called. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity won. Her voice was smaller than I remembered. I wanted you to know, she said. Lydia's moving to Chicago. She's not doing great. She lost everything. Ethan, maybe you don't care, but I thought you should know. I leaned against the workbench, staring at the wood grain under my hand. I don't hate her, Claire. I never did. But she made her choices. She did, Claire said quietly. We all did. There was a long pause before she added, You're reopening the shop. Right, I saw the article about the education program. Dad would have liked that. Yeah, I said. That's the plan. Good, she said softly. Then maybe something good will finally come from all this. When the line went dead, I sat there for a while, listening to the faint hum of the heater and the ticking of the clock. For the first time, I didn't feel angry when I thought of them, just tired. A month later, the workshop officially reopened as the Henry Miller Foundation for Craftsmanship. We offered free training to veterans and young apprentices who wanted to learn the trade. The first group of students arrived on a windy morning in April. Their hands rough, their eyes uncertain. Watching them handle tools for the first time felt like watching my father teach me all over again. Tom helped me set everything up. He stood beside me during the small ceremony, hands shoved in his coat pockets. You sure about this? He asked. You could retire tomorrow and live out your days fishing. I smiled. That's not what Dad built this for. He didn't make money to hide it. He made it to build something that lasts. Tom nodded. You sound like him. I looked around the workshop, now alive with the sound of sandpaper, saws, and laughter. I hope so. Later that afternoon, I drove to the cemetery on the hill above town. The snow had melted, leaving patches of green poking through the soil. I brought 2 bouquets, one for Dad and one for Mom. Their graves sat side by side, just as they should have been. I knelt down and brushed away the dirt from the headstones. I get it now, I said quietly. All of it. You were right to let her believe what she needed to. You knew the truth would find me when I was ready. A soft wind passed through the trees, stirring the leaves. For a moment, it felt like he was listening. When I got back to the shop, I found one of the students standing by the door, holding a broken fishing rod. Mr. Miller, he said shyly. Someone told me you might be able to fix this. It belonged to my dad. I took it from him, turning it over in my hands. The grip was worn smooth. The line guide bent just enough to need careful work. Yeah, I said. I think I can fix it. He smiled, relief flooding his face. Thanks. It's the only thing I have left of him. As he walked away, I felt something shift in my chest. The grief. The anger. The years of trying to prove my worth, it all quieted for a moment. Maybe this was what my father meant when he said the truth would wait until I was ready. Maybe this was what he wanted me to do with it. That night, I sat by the dock with the old tackle box on my lap. The brass latches clicked softly as I opened it. Inside were the drafting tools, the pawnshop receipt, my mother's note, and the uncashed check from Lydia. I added one more thing, a photo of the first group of apprentices, smiling in front of the workshop. The tide was coming in, the moon low and bright over the harbor. I remembered the way Dad used to say that every piece of wood has a memory, that even when it's been cut, it still carries the story of where it came from. I closed the box gently and set it beside me. The air smelled like salt and cedar. Somewhere in the distance, a buoy bell rang against the waves. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Tomorrow, the students would come back. We'd finish the first table, maybe start on the chairs. Life would move again, steady and honest. And the tackle box, the one they'd all laughed at, would stay where it belonged, right here by the water, holding the story that built everything.